correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So then let's go ahead and proceed. So the title of the talk is Population Trends and Distribution of the Eastern Bluebird. And I will try to, in a couple slides, I'll survey or summarize what we plan to cover in the talk. But there's some preliminary comments. Not everything we hear about these days about bluebirds and populations trends, unfortunately, is good. And but it has to be kept in perspective because these are very bad days for birds in North America, all around the world. But we have a lot of data on birds in North America. And in the end of December of 2019, probably one of the most important papers ever in North American ornithology came out. This study in Science about the decline of American avifauna shows that we have lost about a third of our birds, or 3 billion birds, since 1970, which is hard to believe, a half century ago. And in other words, said another way, in 1970, we had roughly 10 billion birds on the continent. Now we have 7. And it's supported by all kinds of evidence. There's very little doubt that there's anything wrong. And it's happening to all kinds of birds, particularly our native sparrows, wood warblers, blackbirds. 33 of the 38 species of American sparrows are in decline. So it's really a tough time for birds. In fact, let me see if I can. How can I advance this? There we go. So about a third of bird species are in urgent need of conservation or they face extinction. And another 562 are what they call the yellow zone. They need conservation, or they're going to slip into the red zone. The last I looked, this is the 2016 data. There's newer data out, but the eastern bluebird was still in the blue zone here, not needing, but the other 2 species I think are in the yellow zone or very close to it. So it's tough times. So overview of the presentation. We're going to cover some definitions, list the sources of the data used, then talk about how bluebird populations can be assessed at a continental level, and maybe even mention how hard it is to assess birds at a continental level, and then examine the population status of the eastern bluebird, including both the distribution, its distribution over its range, and recent population trends. And then finally, time permitting, we'll start to look at some of the possible factors or influences that are driving the current changing status and fortunes of the eastern bluebird. So definitions: the range is just the area that the bluebird is found. And of course, in this graph here, all this pink is the range of the eastern bluebird. That's where the bird is found. The distribution is how the bird is partitioned out over its range. So you see the different colors. The darker the color, the higher the density of bluebirds, or the higher the abundance of bluebirds in that local area. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, but that's the distribution. The population is the total number of birds on the continent as estimated by the surveys. Sometimes you'll hear me say abundance. In fact, you hear me say it a lot. There I'm kind of referring to the population on a smaller level. The abundance of bluebird on a trail, high abundance of bluebirds on the trails in Tennessee, for example. It's really a measure of the population on a smaller scale. And then trend, that's how the population is changing over time. So, sources of data. Almost all I'm going to talk about here is the North American Breeding Bird Survey, but I wanted to say that all of these other bird surveying programs also track the bluebird. Data agrees very well between them, and I'm going to mention these other programs throughout the talk. And I've been looking at them all, but I just couldn't work them all into this talk. So now we'll talk a little bit, since I'm going to mostly talk about North American Breeding Bird Survey, let me just say a few things about it. The North American Breeding Bird Survey, or it's often called the BBS, consists of about 3,800 survey sites, but they're not sites. Each site is actually a route, a 25-mile stretch of rural roadway with 50 precisely located stops, and that's important, precisely located. The surveyor stops at that same 50 places every year. Each route is surveyed during the breeding season, typically in June. A few states in the far north are surveyed in early July. So this is a little map of the first 22 stops on one of my routes. I've been a breeding bird surveyor for about 25 years. Actually, I think 28 years. So this shows I start here in Jackson or Ash Ridge, Ohio, and I stop on these same places. For example, this intersection here on Marshall Road, I stop at that same place. This line here with Adams County, I stop at the same place every year. I record all the birds I see in here I should say I start at a certain time. I have to start 15 minutes before sunrise, 5:40 in this case. I have to be done by 10:40, and you count all the birds. Count all the birds you see or hear within 3 minutes at each stop, and you have to be able to recognize any bird call you hear. In fact, most of the recognition in the morning is by say 90% is by ear, and then later in the afternoon, 60%, probably 70% is by ear, because you can hear in all directions. You can only see one direction at a time. So most of it, what you record, is by ear, and then all this is sent into central headquarters, and that's the survey. So now here are all of the routes for the breeding bird survey. That's my route right there, right, that little guy. If you see this map created in Simple GIS, these are maps that I make. I have my own GIS program. People are coming on. I might have missed her for a few minutes. Approximately so these routes are counted in June. I think that's all I wanted to say about this slide. But I say I do create my own maps because the programs don't always create the map that show the things I want, so I need to have a little bit of flexibility. So here I've now asked the GIS to show only the routes with eastern bluebirds each year, and now we're down to 2,100 routes approximately. That's 56% of the total, and about 43% or 69% of the 63 states and provinces that are covered in the breeding bird survey. So the eastern bluebird is very widely distributed, much more widely than most birds. And I just want to say something. If you have 2,100 routes and you have 50 stops on a route, that means each year about 107,000 observations are made. So, and all of the birds that are counted, the total number of birds counted on all these routes and all these stops goes together to make the estimate for that year. So as you see, it's not child's play to do continental surveys of birds. It's a lot is required. So here I've asked this is the same chart basically, but here I've asked the GPS to code it and show routes by abundance. In other words, if a average route has 10 to 20 bluebirds on it each year, it's this size circle. If it has a tenth of a or 100th of a bluebird on it, it's this size circle. And now you starting to see more blue here. You kind of have a crude distribution here on the range. You can see there's much more blue in this part of the country, but we can do much better than that. But I just wanted to show you how that data is used. So here is the breeding bird surveys, the BBS's own distribution. Here we use a computer program to say if there's so many bluebirds here and so many bluebirds there, what is the actual distribution of the bluebirds across the continent? And of course, it's a computer estimate and it's not exact, but they're quite good. But for example, if there was a lake right here, it would show bluebirds in this spot, and it would the math program wouldn't know there was a lake there. But generally speaking, this is you can see the distribution kind of is similar to those blue dots I had, and that the bluebird is by far a bird of the southeastern corridor of the range. You can use the same data, even though this data is meant for trends, you can use it to estimate total population. And based in 2015, I should say 2005 to 2015 is the latest data dump from BBS. So I'm going to be talking mostly about 2005 to 2015 data. In 2025, they will dump another bunch of data on us. But we estimated in 2015 23 million bluebirds based on this data. So you can get a lot of mileage out of this data. So I found it convenient for my work to divide the continent into 5 bluebird regions. I don't know if anybody else uses this. I don't think they do. This is just a convention I use to make my work easier. I have 5 regions: a northern region, which contains about 4% of all the bluebirds; a western region, which contains about 6%, that's the orange out here; and then a midwestern region, 19%; northeastern, I should say, with about, what was that, 9%, and then a southeastern region containing about 61% of the bluebird population. Now, this does not count the bluebirds in Mexico. There are some bluebirds in Mexico, and not an insignificant number. So this isn't all bluebirds, but in North America and Canada, this is still a reasonably accurate distribution. There might be as many as 5 to 10% in Mexico. So you could probably partition all these numbers down a percent or two to add them to the Mexican contribution. But you can see how important. I wanted to make a point, and is that, if we have a trouble up here in the northern range, that's bad, but it's not critical because that's only 4% of the population. If we have trouble down here in the southeast, that's real bad, because this is our breadbasket for bluebirds. This is where we raise our bluebirds. This is the source of our continental population, and that's going to come into play here in the next slides coming up. So that's the distribution. And how about the trend? And so for the trend, and you're going to see graphs like this before, this is the data from each survey is used and plotted against its year. So here in the year 1980, this is the number of bluebirds that were found on the survey that year. It's the estimate. And you see a number called index here. That's not a population index. This is a relative thing. So as the index goes up, the program estimates a higher population of bluebirds. It's not necessary to know this absolute number. You just need to see the trend. So you can see that if we look from 1996 to 2015,
66.
did I say the wrong year? 1966. It goes from I heard someone speak there. I don't know. Maybe it was not clear what I said. 1966. So you can see the trend from 1966 to 2015 is positive. We've been growing bluebirds at a rate of about 1.5 to 2% per year. So if we look at that, we could put the smiley face on it without any doubt. But if we did that, we'd be kidding ourselves, because it's not important anymore what happened here. These bluebirds have been dead for 30 years, 32 years. What's important is happening now. And you see that now we have the worried face, because in reality, from 2000, the trend from 2005 to 2015 is basically no trend. A tenth of a percent per year across the range. That's basically not different from zero. So for some reason, what we did back here is not working now. And that's the most concerning part of the talk. And I'll expand on that. Okay, so here I wanted to break that out a little bit for you. Here again are the decade. The breeding bird survey has been going around for about 5 decades now, and here are the 5 decades broken out. Here are the trends for bluebird population in each of those decades. The first decade, 66 to 75, we were growing about 0.5% per year. Then the next decade, 1.5%, and then nearly 4%, which is just outstanding. So when it dropped down to 2% in 95 to 205, nobody was particularly worried, because 2% is still pretty amazing when you have other birds that are going down every year. And then we got hit with the bad news in about 2017 when they released the 2015 data. So why did we get blindsided? And the answer to that is because we got blindsided and we had no idea this was coming. Okay, so let me show you that all again. And here are that graph that I showed you initially. Here's the year by year change in the population estimate. That's the index over here. Remember, the growing index means growing population. So the population was growing, and then we flattened out. And here you can see how the change was in the decades: 0.5%, 1.5%. almost 3%, almost 4%, then it dropped down to 2%, and then wham, we were hit with this. And we don't know what we're going to see in 2025 when they release the next set of data. However, sometime this summer, I will be presenting that because I've been going into the database and hand calculating these numbers, and I'll have that sometime this summer. So far in 2016, it went up, and then 2017, it went down. That's where I am right now. So we'll see what it looks like. Say sometime this summer, hopefully, if I get back at it, I'll have that at least this trend. I won't have the state numbers, but so is this happening across the whole range? And the answer is kind of, but no. If you break the Bluebird range up into the most basic section, you could say USA and Canada. Well, USA contains 90% of the bluebirds, 95%, 90 to 95%. So the US trend is going to look exactly like the continental trend. In other words, we grew the population in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then it's flattened out here in the 2005 to 2015. But look at our friends up in Canada here. They're going like gangbusters. They're gaining at 4% per year, but they only have 5% of the population. It would sure be nice if these trends were the other way around. We had the growth here, and they were holding their own there. Not to wish the Canadians bad luck, but they're not really in the range of the eastern bluebird for the most part. Anyway, it would be nice to have the growth down here where the population is headquartered. If you're a Canadian or somebody from Canada, I'm not playing favorites here. I'm just talking population ecology. So you wonder how. So you all want to know about Tennessee, and I wish I had better news. Tennessee is has one of the highest abundances in the continent. An average bluebird route in Tennessee has 14.4 bluebirds. But the last 10 years for which we have data, the trend has been negative in Tennessee. And I'm going to give you some thoughts as to why that might be. It certainly isn't because of the efforts of bluebirders who are out there doing what they can. But I think that's my point. What we did before to grow the population doesn't seem to be working across the whole continent right now. But if you step across the border here to Carolina, they don't have as many bluebirds. They have a high abundance. There's only 10 bluebirds on average per route in North Carolina, but they have been continued to grow their population at about 2% per year over this period of 2005, 2015. And again, you'll see I'm strongly leaning towards climatic conditions to explain that, and we'll get into that. So I'm kind of prefacing part of the talk to follow. Let me just say something. Am I going too fast here? Anybody want to venture opinion? I can't hear anyone.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, let's plunge forward. So here's Kentucky, same story as Tennessee. Oh, whoop. I don't know why that happens every now and then. I think when I touch the wheel on the mouse, it jumps. So I have to kind of be dainty. So Kentucky's kind of doing the same thing but they're in worse shape than Tennessee by far. Their growth wasn't as good over this period, and in the last 2005, 2015, they're losing at 10% per year. And they had I'm sure the abundance isn't that high anymore, but historically they had a high abundance, the same as Tennessee, 14 bluebirds per route. And Missouri, the same thing. Missouri has the highest abundance of any state or province, 15 bluebirds on average per route, and they're declining like Tennessee at 3% per year. So obviously I can't show you all of these slides for every state. So here's a slide. I apologize for this slide, but I tell you what, I tried 100 different ways to represent this data. There's no easy way to show it. So I'm just going to plunge through on this slide. It's not as bad as it looks. What you have here is two sets of bars, a set of blue bars, which are always positive, and a set of red bars, which can be negative or positive. The blue bars are abundance. The red bars are trend. So up here, you have the two-state abbreviation for every state and province that has bluebirds. From Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, North Carolina, on down here to North Dakota, Quebec, New Brunswick, Colorado, and Wyoming. And so the red bars show abundance. And so you see Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, they have high abundance. It's 15, 14, 10 bluebirds on average per route. This is the historical averages. These states down here have much less than one bluebird per route. They're not in bluebird range. These states are. And the red lines now are the trends. And look at this. Our three biggest bluebird states are all negative trend now. They're losing bluebirds. Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee. And some of our other highest population states for bluebirds are barely showing positive growth, nothing more than 3%. Illinois, minus 5%, or Indiana. Illinois, minus 10%. But look out here, these states that have very few bluebirds, they're going like gangbusters. They're increasing their population, but it doesn't mean much because there's not much there. You increase a small number by 100%, it's still a small number probably. So let's move on. So that's the summary view, but I'm going to show it to you a little better. I'm going to show you it on a map, okay? I'm going to put all this data on a map for you. And that's why I say it's handy to be able to draw my own map. So what I've done here is I put all of this abundance data on map. So if a state is colored dark green, it means it has 5 to 15 bluebirds on average for a breeding bird survey route in that state. And so Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina. I was almost said Virginia. I do that all the time. So all these states are dark green, and the lighter shades of green are still 2 to 5%, and the lighter shade of green is 1 to 2.5. Yellow is kind of 1 to 1%, 1 to 1 to 0.1 to 1 bluebird on average per route, and then the red is very few bluebirds per route. Well, there's nothing wrong with this chart. This is a distribution range. The bluebirds are a highest concentration down in their heart of their range, and they thin out as you get towards the edge of the range down to very small numbers at the end. That's exactly the way our distribution should look like. This abundance chart is exactly the way our distributions look like, so we put the happy face on that. Let me show you the next slide. And unfortunately, it's the same slide, but what I've done here is drawn a circle around these states. Why? Because these states hold 22% of the bluebird population in North America. I think there's about 12 or is it 14 states here? I don't remember. It doesn't matter. They hold 22% of the population. I want you to keep your eye on those states because the next slide I'm going to show you is the population trend on a map. Now here, green, dark green means growing 3 to 10% per year, or next green, 2.5 to 3% per year, or 1 to 2.5%, or holding its own from 0 to minus 2%, and then clearly losing minus 2 to 10%. And so these states that I told you held 22% of the bluebirds, every single one of them, with the exception of Iowa there, is yellow or red. So there is the answer to the first part of the question. Why have we stopped growing our continental bluebird population? Because part of the heart of our range is having a problem right now, and that's why we're at this situation. I think that's my theory, but I think it's logical. So conclusions from so far, data, and I was going to say that the data from the eBird and the CBC strongly support the BBS data. So at a continental level, the eastern bluebird population seems stable at the moment, but it has probably not been growing over the last 2 decades. The breeding stock appears to be declining on important parts of its breeding range, such as the Midwest. There it goes again. Let's see if I can make it back up there. Oh my goodness. So the population appears to be declining on important parts of its breeding range, such as the Midwest and important southeastern states. In contrast, the breeding stock, which is measured by the BBS, it's done in June, the breeding stock appears to be increasing at the edges of its range. When I say population, we're talking about the population of the breeding stock, and I hope that was obvious. It's the June population, it's the breeding stock. So since 2000, bluebirds are not responding to our efforts like they did before. And we don't know exactly why, but we're going to consider some reasons. So it seems like we're at the Alice in Wonderland moment in bluebirding, where Alice says it's hard to get anywhere here, and the Red Queen says to get anywhere, to stay in one place, you have to run as fast as you can. To get anywhere, you have to run twice as fast. And maybe those of us who have worked so hard to preserve bluebirds now have to work twice as hard to keep them going. That's our reward. No good deed goes unpunished, as they say. So let's consider some factors. Well, climate, sudden prolonged periods of heat, cold, rain. We know that affects our breeding season, but it affects more than that because these things come in the spring and the winter, and I think they're a big factor. And I'm gonna try to make that point to you later. Food supply, certainly, we know that again during certain parts of the breeding season, if we have a dry season, we're running short of insects. If we have a wet, rainy season, they start to try to feed their nestlings earthworms, and that only works for a few days. And so, on a short-term breeding season, they can affect things. But I'm talking here about a food supply that affects the population over a longer term, maybe through the whole season. We'll talk a little bit about that. None of these are very easy to tease out. Habitat loss is something that everyone, it's habitat loss. But when you get down to it, trying to say, what is habitat loss for bluebirds? That is not easy, as you'll see. Nest box predators and nest box competitors, they're out there. Epizootics, diseases, invertebrate pests. And here's one that we never talk about: reduced numbers of bluebirders. How long? We're not the youngest group in the world, us, the bluebirders. And are we replacing our numbers? I have no idea. And the internet is both our friend and our foe. It wouldn't it be nice if you put up a bluebird box? And then Nabs gets these calls on the hotline. I put up a nest box, I got bluebirds, but my cat killed the male. So, I mean, this is a real, I think, a real concern. It's not a joke, it's a real concern. Okay, next slide. So climate is pretty easy one to look at because the effects of climate are direct. They're not playing through anything, they're coming to us directly. And we've all seen these graphs where we're seeing warmer temperatures. The solid lines are the satellite and the bars are the surface measurements. And of course, how that plays out is in warmer ambient temperatures. And this is the average ambient temperature comparing two regions, 1991 to 1960 versus 1991 to 2012. And there has been a warming in the west and the north of maybe approximately 2 degrees. Not so much over most of the eastern bluebird range, though, actually. It's been much less there. But where that plays out, I think, for certain, warming trends are not good for nesting. The Cornell did a big study a few years ago where they looked at 32,000 eggs from 7,000 nest boxes, 130 sites. These are the sites. And what they found is that the probability of an egg failure increased as you went to the southern latitudes. As you went south, the probability of having a failed egg in the nest increased. And that's what you'd expect because it's warmer. And I want to just put on a little plug here for NestWatch. I mean, folks, if we can get data into NestWatch, they can do so much for us. How hard would it be for the Tennessee Bluebird Society to do a study on 32,000 eggs? Well, NestWatch can do it like sitting at their computer because they have the data from all over the continent coming in. So if we can get data into these folks, they can do scientific studies on bluebirding, not bluebirds, scientific studies on bluebirding, and that would be real important for us. So getting back now to the climate thing, this is another similar graph, but it talks about warming in the winter months. And here you see this compares 1895 to 2017, and you can see the warming again occurring here in the north central states primarily, but the west mostly. And again, over most of the bluebird range, you don't see that much warming going on. But I think this has a double effect, even though it's not where we're breeding the bluebirds, where the temperature is going up in the winter. I think these warming temperatures probably encourage bluebirds to remain at more northerly latitudes. It's bluebirds are short-term migrants. They're not like hummingbirds where people say, "Oh, don't take down that nectar because they'll stay and freeze to death." Well, we know hummingbirds don't use nectar as a guide to whether they should migrate, but these short distance migrants do use things like that. And so I believe this does encourage bluebirds to remain more northerly. And then these warming temperatures contribute to another factor: more frequent and persistent polar vortex disruptions. That's what the weatherman calls a polar vortex. It's a misnomer. They're polar vortex disruptions. I even did a slide on it here just to make the point, because the polar vortex is, oh, good and grief. How did I do that? How do I keep doing that? Okay, here. Sorry, folks. I am technically challenged. I'm going to leave that pointer alone. I need to point some things out. The polar vortex is this area over the North Pole. It's a low pressure region of very cold air surrounded by a jet stream that's in the stratosphere 10 to 30 miles above the Earth. And in normal situations, the polar vortex is intact. This cold weather we're shielded from that. And this normal jet stream that controls our weather doesn't interfere because it's 10 miles below it at least. But when you have these warming periods, when you have the warm weather, it causes warm air to push up. And that starts to cause what they call these sudden stratospheric warming events. That breaks up the jet stream that's holding the low pressure air, cold air up here, breaks up. And then the jet stream, that air drops down. Our jet stream catches it. And that's why we have these polar vortex disruptions, or these deadly freezing winds and cold and sleet that comes down, and it becoming more frequent as time goes on. This was the one from 2019, which was one of the biggest ones lately. Here you can see the clouds being blown down over into the center of the country. And we had wind chills of -90 in some of the north, or -80 in some of the northern states. And this is the actual temperature. You can see here's the purple is -40. So you can see -40 got pretty deep into the country. -30 is the blue. And so the next year, after that following spring, we got reports of 100 to 150 dead bluebirds in roost boxes. So if there are 150 dead birds in roost boxes, can you imagine how many dead bluebirds there must have been in ones that couldn't get in a roost box? So, and that went very far south. So even if the birds went south, they've got hit by this, and we've had smaller polar vortexes every year since. So that, I think, is a very big factor, because these things always seem to chug down right over the middle of the country. And we can talk about that if we have time for questions. I'm going to leave this slide off. This is a talk about the effect of climate on habitat. It's not that exciting. And in the interest of time, let's move on to the second factor. Factors influencing bluebird population trends, perhaps insects. Well, bluebirds are insects. They need supplies of insects to raise their nestlings. And we've seen over the past decades a lot of reports about insect crashes, and they've used the term insect apocalypse. If true, this would have massive implications for bluebirds. And there are recorded cases of invertebrate crashes, and indeed invertebrates are declining. But whether the question is how uniform, how general is it? This is a couple studies from Germany, where they looked at insects trapped in a ground trap, comparing two periods, 1989 and 2013. You can see in 2019 in July, they got almost a kilogram of insects in their traps, a little over 100 milligrams in 2012. And these are plots of flying insects. You can see they steadily decreased. So yeah, insects are declining. However, in response to this situation, the Entomological Society of America had a big symposium. They had 12 or 13 of the best entomologists in the world, come and give a paper, and they were all published in the Journal of the National Academy of Sciences. There's a survey paper called Insect Decline in the Anthropocene, and they are cautioned about going too far on a limb. They think that a lot of these studies suffer from unjustified assumptions, analytical issues, and most importantly, perhaps over extrapolations. And understanding insect declines is complicated by the fact that of the estimated 4 to 6 million species of insects, we only have named about 1 million. And much variation in time and space and taxonomic linkage and rates of population, there's a lot of variation across space and time and taxonomic linkage, and the rates of population increase and decrease vary annually. In fact, many insects have cycles, and so if you measure it at one part in the cycle and then you come back next time and you're not in the same cycle, it'll look higher or lower. And so people need to put these things into context. So the general statement about insect apocalypse should be viewed with caution. Not all insects are declining, but clearly details matter when you're talking about insects declines. However, I don't want to leave the impression, and here's an example of how things can be misleading. For example, we hear so much about butterflies. Butterflies are crashing worldwide. Well, if you look at butterflies, about 25, maybe 30% of the butterfly species are decreasing, and about 70% are stable. But if you go to grasshoppers, orthopterans, almost all of them are decreasing. I wouldn't have thought that, a priori without seeing this. Beetles are also in a lot more trouble than butterflies. Here's the same thing shown on this slide. So when we say insects are crashing, we need to be very specific and careful about what we're talking about. Again, that said, it's clear that insects are probably doing worse right now than vertebrates. This study shows that about 41% of insect species have declined over the past decade, compared to about 22% of vertebrate species. Probably most people wouldn't have thought that was true. And finally, so perhaps there's no insect populations, but there are clearly documented declines in specific situations and locations. And we've all run the bug test like we used to get in the 30 years ago when we would drive out in the country. This is what our windshield would look like. That's not true anymore, or it's almost not true anymore. And we do know about these declines in honeybees and butterflies and lightning bugs. This is well established. And standardized assays have documented dramatic declines in insects. So there, without a doubt, we need to consider insects as one of the possible reasons for our issues with raising bluebirds, because they are insectivores. But I don't think at this point in time we could pin anything on insects. And insects, again, are just a way for other stressors to express themselves, if I could say it that way. In other words, insects respond to deforestation, loss of grasslands. They respond to changes in agricultural practice and pesticides. They respond to changes in weather and climate. Introduced insect species impact native species just like all other life forms. So insects might be a messenger or might be an intermediary that reflects a lot of these changes in these other variables. Mm-hmm. And this graph, I think, was nice to show that from that insect. Here is death by 1,000 cuts theory. All of these things that affect every other living thing on the planet. In other words, the fact that humans are appropriating more and more of the land affects insects the same way. Factors influencing bluebird populations. habitat loss. Well, yeah, but that's an easy thing to say, but what does it mean? What is a good description or definition of bluebird habitat? How about some of these? Would any of these work for you? They're not all the same. They have similarities, they're not all the same. And how useful are these without cavities? So if you want to consider bluebird habitat, it's not that simple. I think measuring trends in grassland may be an indication, but there's a lot more to it than just measuring trends in grassland. And a lot of habitat needs to be supplemented or maintained. So even if it's there, if it's not maintained, for example, if a grassland weren't kept free of tall grass or woody vegetation, it wouldn't be much use to bluebirds. Same thing, nest box trails have to be kept in repair. So it's a complicated stew. This is my equivalent of a slide, where the detective is trying to figure out a case and he's got all these sticky notes on the wall and he's trying to put things together. So what's happened to bluebirds? Well, 2.5 million years ago, the eastern bluebird split off from the Sialia line to form the eastern bluebird and the western. At that time, they were a very rare bird, existing only in clearings probably, and fires and windfalls in the middle of a forest. 30,000 years ago, they started to get a break. People came here and started wrecking things and providing more habitat probably for bluebirds. The arrival of the Europeans is when things really got moving with the clearing of the primary forests, and then the grassland increased, and forest edges started to increase, and so there were holes at the edges of forests by woodpeckers, and so the eastern bluebird started to become a common country bird. But even as we started to help them, we started to hinder them, because in this decade, 200 and almost 300 million acres of grassland went to cropland and urban development. And then we took away the natural cavities with the house sparrows and the starlings in the 90s. And then at the same time, we started changing agricultural practices big time. We got rid of the horses. We farmed right out to the edge. We got rid of the hedgerows. Horse droppings don't contain any grain. That's a thing that played to the detriment of house sparrows, actually. But bluebirds started declining over its range with all these insults occurring to its livelihood. Well, in the 30s, then we started the bluebirding movement, and then we had our bluebird societies, and the recovery started. And now we look a lot to the Conservation Reserve Program as a measure of grassland, but that is currently decreasing. But here's the thing about the Conservation Reserve. I don't know how much use the Conservation Reserve grasslands are to bluebirds, quite frankly, because if a farmer puts his land in a Conservation Reserve contract, he has to sign an agreement saying he won't put structures on it. In other words, they don't want him building a granary or a feed shed or something like that on the Conservation Reserve. Well, I've written 3 letters to the Department of Agriculture over the years asking them to ask the Farm Services Agency to stop calling nest boxes structures. Because in theory, a nest box is a structure and you can't put it on a Conservation Reserve plot. So how do you like that? So I don't know how much good it's doing it. So let's get now to something else more close to home. How much are we playing into this? We're the people that brought the bluebirds back, but are we sustaining ourselves? I wish I've been thinking, how can I figure out how many bluebirders or how many nest boxes are there in North America today compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago? There must be a way to do it. What is the percentage of all bluebirders that belong to NABs or one of our societies? I'll bet it's maybe 5%, or is it 1%? And that's important, because if you're not doing things right, using the right nest boxes, the safe mounts, regular monitoring, predator controls, then you end up with tragedies. You end up with failed nests, which to me is the same as electricity growing to the ground. That's one whole breeding cycle lost. So I wonder about our role in this. There was a survey done at our at our conference, the NABS conference in Alberta in 2016, this guy, Dr. Glenn Venegard, and his partner, Robin Perkins, interviewed all the attendees there. And they did a study and it published a paper later and said that what we already know, bluebirds are older and more educated than the general population. We spend a lot of time and money on our trails. We're invested in keeping up and expanding our trails. We hope to carry out our trails for another 15 years, but none of us have any plans to take over the trail when we retire. I don't know, that's probably not everybody, but that was a general trend for the people that he surveyed. There were about, I think, 150 bluebirders at that conference. So to the extent that that's representative, perhaps bluebirders are not providing the support that they used to because their numbers aren't as great, or they don't have access to habitat. Reproduction is clearly a factor. And this is where I, again, put another plug for NestWatch. We don't have a reliable estimate of our production. Tennessee has a number, you know how many you produce each year. And Illinois knows how much they produce each year, and places like that. But we don't have it centralized. If we could get this data, we don't have it in a form that people could do statistics on it. In other words, 60,000 nest boxes or 100,000 nest boxes. If we could all get our data into Cornell NestWatch, we could start doing that. And I've asked Robin about the possibility of them developing a bluebird reproduction model so that we could get an idea on a continental scale each season how we've done that year, and then we could tie that in with our winter estimate in the CBC and our spring estimate in the BBS and our year-round estimate in the CBC, and then we could probably start pinning down exactly where some of our issues are. We'd have the data for that. So another plug for NestWatch. Yeah, these are issues, but we can deal with most of these. Some are harder to deal with than others. These are less common, and when they happen, but they usually don't happen very often. We have competition from native cavity nesters, which we encourage or permit. And then we have this from house sparrows and starlings, and this we can control, this we can't. Pernicious, this is my definition, often lethal nest box competitor, which there are no effective controls that are practical in all situations, and that's absolutely true. So I'll pound on house sparrows just a few minutes and then we'll conclude. So house sparrows, where are they found? Well, oh, joy, joy, joy. They're found on 73% of the routes. Okay, again, this is one of my charts. And you can see that they're not evenly distributed. There are hotspots of house sparrows around the continent. So down here in the southeast, they probably don't have any trouble with house sparrows, but that might be a different story up in these states, Illinois and Ohio. The good news is the house sparrow population is declining. You don't live here, you don't grow up here, it's not going to work out for you in the long run, pal. So they have been declining since the survey was started, so they probably had started declining. People now think they probably started declining about in the right after they peaked in about the 1990s, 1890s. Sorry. So we estimate today there's 100 to 100 million house sparrows, 23 million bluebirds. Here is I put the house sparrows and the bluebird trends on the same side so you can get a difference of the scale between them. Bluebirds only go up to an index value of about 5. House sparrows start at 140 and go down to 20. But look at this trend. Back when the survey started in 66, the index ratio for house sparrows to bluebirds was 60. Now it's 4. So that's a 15-fold increase. That's certainly in the right direction. Maybe in another half century, we'll be worrying a lot less about house sparrows if that trend continues. But I still think they might have a role to play, because I went through and did a calculation of the ratio of house sparrows to bluebirds in each state. And if it's green, you guys have 1 to 5 house sparrows for every bluebird. If you're in a yellow zone, like Kentucky, 6 to 20. But if you're up here like Ohio, we have like 50 to 100. If you're in Illinois and Iowa, North Dakota, you have 100 to 1,000 house sparrows per bluebirds. So if all things equal, certainly that high number of house sparrows is not helping. So I think they could be a contributing factor to bluebird populations and the bluebird populations in these areas. And remember, Illinois is dropping by 7% per year. Next slide here. So here's I also have a program I can use to distribute the birds based on the range. And this is my distribution for house sparrows. You can see it's pretty much the same as the BBS's. And there's a method to my madness here. So here's the distribution for the house sparrows. You can see the high concentrations here in the Midwest, up here in Alberta and California. And so I can do the same thing for bluebirds, right? So here's the hot spots for bluebirds. That's the same thing again as BBS shows. But why am I doing this? Because I can put them on the same graph if I do that. Okay, so here's a graph of land use. This yellow is farmland, and this is grassland, the light green, and this is the coniferous forest, and this is deciduous forest. This is savanna. And you can see these are the hot spots for bluebirds. And lo and behold, it just happens that the hot spots for bluebirds are where the house sparrows aren't. So I rest my case. No, I'm saying that I think that in situations where there's a lot of competition anyway, or things are not ideal anyway, the house sparrow still could be a problem that's impacting our ability to grow bluebirds, to raise bluebirds, to increase the population. So now it's time for comments and questions and making excuses for why I didn't answer the questions. Okay, let me see. Let me see if I can stop sharing here. All right, folks.
Hey, Bernie, this is Don Hazel.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a couple comments. One, we're growing bluebirds where we monitor here very well. We're gaining bluebirds. We monitor over 1,000 bluebird boxes by our Tennessee Bluebird Society, and we're gaining a couple hundred every year. And bluebird populations that we monitor are going up. Now we don't know where we're not monitoring, but
where are you in the state?
Well, we have 6 local clubs around the state. Most of them are the eastern part of the state. One in Memphis, one in Chattanooga, Cookeville, Crossville, Loudon, and we're around the state, mostly in the eastern side. We're trying to gain additional clubs. Individuals put up boxes, but clubs put up hundreds of boxes. So we're trying to start more clubs, and we've been pretty successful for that in the last few years. So as you put up a box and you get a bluebird. The ratio, we put up a box and 9 out of 10 times we get a bluebird first year. So that's very successful. We're trying to add more boxes, and we are. Weather plays a big part. Back in 2015, we had a major ice storm where I live. And for instance, one trail alone, we went from 90, we had 25 boxes. We went from 90 bluebirds one year to 20 the next. 2 years ago in northwestern Tennessee, we had about 25 boxes up there. We haven't had a bluebird in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. Because the ice storm, if it lasts a week, the bluebirds have nothing to eat for a week and we lose them all. So those are some individual weather issues that can cause a problem. Now they come back, but it takes them a couple of years to recover.
Right. Yeah. That thing in 1976,
Yeah, we know that was a big year around the country.
Yep. Yeah. And that was a big polar vortex disruption that year.
Okay.
And that was, I remember I was in graduate school at Ohio State. I'd just gotten out of the Army and gotten back to grad school. That was my welcome back. And I remember trying to fix points. I had a BMW 2002, and the points. A man standing out there in that cold wind trying to put the points. That was very, very cold. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I'm interested in what you say, because why isn't that being part of your question is why isn't that being reflected in what the BBS sees? And that's I think a very good question. And to the extent that the Tennessee Bluebird Society has tentacles out into the entire state, I think it would be good. I mean, I think Tennessee is a place that we should do some research, because the breeding bird survey and the eBird survey shows these declines in Tennessee.
Yeah.
You're saying that you got spots where it's increasing.
Yeah, everywhere we have clubs and where we are adding boxes, we are definitely increasing every year. Bluebirds, and especially tree swallows. We're really showing increases in tree swallows. So that's one.
And that's another bird that's crashing.
Yeah, well, we're growing them like crazy. Tree swallows are really growing rapidly where we are putting boxes. Another issue is house sparrows. We don't have we don't have too many house sparrow problems around the state.
Nope.
Where we have them, we know we're going to have them. You know, somewhere near a farm or someplace where there's grain. We have house sparrow problems. We kind of manage them on a one-by-one basis, and we work pretty well keeping those under control. We're starting to go to 4 or 5 foot Kingston predator guards, because we have found that black snakes can get over the 2 foot Kingston predator guard. So we're
absolutely
starting to add the longer predator guards. So that's one thing. And then Nest Watch. We've tried Nest Watch. Most of our monitors are retirement age, and Nest Watch is on your phone, technical. It's sometimes it's over the head of a lot of our folks.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. But I'll tell you what, if you consolidate your data,
yeah,
I want to put you in contact with the South Carolina Bluebird Society, because they have developed some methods now to supply the consolidated data from their whole state.
Good. That's good. We will contact them. Our new president has already contacted Cornell and said, Nest Watch gives us trouble, and they're talking about how we can present a spreadsheet rather than individual. So South Carolina would be a good one to talk to. So we hope to be able to provide Nest Watch information, but not on an individual box by box, cell phone by cell phone basis. It's just too much for our monitors, I think.
Well, I'm going to send you something. I don't know how long it'll take me to get it, because this time of year, I don't. It seems like no matter what I have or touch, it goes wrong. And when you're really busy, everything goes wrong to make you even more busy. So, but it probably after the turn of the year, I will send you a couple maps of where the breeding bird survey routes are in Tennessee, because it'd be just interesting from your perspective to see what you think about that. And then I'm going to also try to send you I'm going to show you the routes in Tennessee where they're finding bluebirds and where they're not, and see if that makes sense.
Perfect. Yeah. And then one last thing, we agree, we go to our annual Bluebird meeting and we're all 65 or older, except for a few. Yeah. So we've started an elementary education program where we go to elementary schools, present about bluebirds, put a bluebird box in their schoolyard, and we're talking to 3rd through 6th graders and trying to get the next generation of bluebirders started, because we agree with you. Many of us are older, and we're trying to get the new group started. So we're hoping to show some success with that program this year here in Tennessee.
Super. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the guy who used to be president of the Tennessee Bluebird Society. He was on the board at NABS.
Chuck
James.
Chuck James,
Yeah, James. Yeah. Is he still working? He's still active there in the
He is. He's kind of stepped back a little bit. He's on the board of directors as a board of directors emeritus, but yeah, he still is active. Keeps up our website, and he's still active in one of the local chapters. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all the things you say are definitely right. I mean, and it is curious. I mean, I've heard this from many places. You know, that, well, you tell us that the state is not doing well, or BBS tells us the state's not doing well, but we're doing great where we are.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, well, on the other hand, you know, I'm thinking of my route, the route that I count right now. I used to count 3 routes for the BBS, but I just got tired of getting up at 4 in the morning for 3 times and going out there and do that. So I only count 1 now. But yeah, I mean, I don't see a lot of I don't see the number of bluebirds that I think, and I don't see a lot of nest boxes either when I'm doing that route. So I think it is definitely a function of where you have bluebirders, you still have bluebirds. But there's so many areas maybe now that we don't have bluebirders. Maybe that's part of the problem. But I do think that cold air coming down like that every winter, that is a real setback, I think. And especially when you have multiple years in a row.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, very good.
Hey, I'll just mention, I have relatives in Western Pennsylvania. You're going to have a real bluebird decline in Western Pennsylvania next year, because they're getting about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch ice, which will eliminate all their food for the next week or 2.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I found very useful, you know, when we have these cold spells like that in the winter, I start listening in the spring for Carolina wrens, because Carolina wrens are the only bird I know for sure that is even more sensitive to these cold snaps than the eastern bluebird. So if you hear Carolina wrens in the spring, because they're so vocal, you know, if you hear Carolina wrens, then there's a good chance the bluebirds made it too. If you don't hear any Carolina wrens, I really start to worry.
Yeah.
So they're a nice little canary in the coal mine, so to speak.
You know, and let me mention, one of our board members said our favorite app is the Merlin app. And I was using the Merlin app last week, and you know, to identify sound. Now you can identify birds by sound. I'm terrible at it, but you turn on the Merlin app and identify by sound, it'll show you 6 or 8 birds that are singing out there all at the same time.
Yep.
Makes you an expert.
I have it on my cell phone, but I've never tried it. I should. You're kind of in. I think maybe I'll try it sometime this week and see how it works.
It's unbelievable. It told us we were hearing a ruby throated, a ruby crowned kinglet the other day, and we eventually spotted it. It was unbelievable. So that's a great app. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
I have it, and I've heard a yellow-billed cuckoo in my neighborhood, and I'm like, what?
Oh.
Never saw it, but a yellow-billed cuckoo is in my neighborhood.
Yeah. And this was just recently?
This was a couple months ago.
Oh yeah, okay. Because I was going to say he better get himself out of there pretty quick. If he...
Yeah, we're due for some really, really cold weather. We're in Chattanooga, and we're going to be down in the 10s.
Yeah.
So
In the
that's a
10s,
little
did you say?
cold for us.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, next week is going to be real cold here.
Yeah, you know, where is this coming from? I've been so busy the last. Usually, I keep pretty good track of the weather. When we get done here, I'm going to look at the weather. I usually look at the weather when I'm at the fitness center in the morning. Yeah, but I didn't see anything like 10. But I better do some looking. Yeah.
Yeah. High of like 25.
Oh, okay.
Well, Bernie, this was really very, very interesting to us. We really appreciate it. And I know we've heard from a number of people that had a conflict and they can't wait to see the recording.
Okay, well, we'll have it. And I'll post
Bernie,
it.
could I ask a question?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, this is Pat Vincent, and there's 2 things that seem to be conflicting to me. One is this current discussion we just had about the cold snap and how deleterious that is. But earlier in your talk, did you say, my notes say, that the egg failure increases with higher ambient temperatures? Is that right?
Sure. Yeah. What happens is, the warmer the temperature, the higher the probability is that you'll have a box where it gets above 105 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And when
So-
that happens, then the egg the embryo is killed.
Okay, so we could have too cold and that's a problem, or we could have too hot and that's a problem.
Absolutely.
For the too hot issue, is there a suggestion that the construction of the nest box change so that there's more air circulation?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you can get a hold of, are you by chance a member of NABS? No. Okay. The NABS journal, Bluebird, this next issue that's going to be coming onto the stands, I think it should hit the stands early in late in December or early in January. We've got 2 big articles in there on people that have been altering the construction of nest boxes and putting heat shields on them and stuff like that, and measuring the internal temperature. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton you can do, and where you can actually get some really good information on that is go to the Texas Bluebird Society, because they deal with that every year. In fact, the Texas Bluebird Society often tells us, you guys from NABS can keep your advice. It doesn't apply to Texas. It's so different down here, and in a certain sense, they're right. I mean, the problems they deal with are quite, fire ants and high temperatures and things like that. So they have their own ways of doing a lot of things. But Texas Bluebird Society has done a lot of work on how to keep a nest box cool in high temperatures, including heat shields and ventilation and things like that.
And you had a slide that it was, it seemed to show that there was no change in Tennessee in ambient temperatures. I'm not sure if I read that right. It was the slide that you
Oh,
showed.
well, there was
before
and relatively little change. That whole central part of the country has not warmed up nearly as much as the West and the Northwest, particularly. I guess where the heat increases the most is down in the Four Corners region and in Arizona, I guess. I don't know if Arizona last year, weren't they almost the whole summer over 90? The entire summer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Could be.
So hopefully some of that will dissipate. I mean, I'm not 100% convinced that the whole problem is CO2. I mean, I think it's a factor, but I think there's a lot more to be understood before we draw a hard conclusion on that. But I think the most discouraging thing is, if CO2 is important, we're almost powerless to do anything about it, because in this country we have cut back our CO2 emissions by 10 or 12% over the last couple decades. But places like China, are now alone. China alone is producing almost twice as much CO2 as the rest of the world combined, and they're going the other direction. So it's kind of discouraging to think that we're going to pay a whole lot of money to decrease CO2 in this country, and it's not going to mean any difference whatsoever to the global temperature. So it's a really tough issue, and but I think in terms, my feeling is right now the biggest contribution of climate to bluebirds is this tendency to produce these big ice storms in the winter, because that's got to be deadly for bluebirds. I think we can deal with heat in the summer by, like you say, designing our nest boxes right, and unless it gets so dry that there's no insects, I think the bluebirds will still be able to produce, but they can't produce when they're frozen to death. That's for sure.
I have another question for you, if that's okay.
Yep.
And that's about the insects. There's a lot of enthusiasm for planting areas to attract monarch butterflies and to support monarch butterfly population. I'm wondering if there is a possibility of cultivating, if you will, areas just to support insect population in general and not just certain caterpillars.
Definitely. In fact, there's societies forming all over now. You know, there's always been societies for monarch butterflies and fireflies and honeybees. Now there's getting to be these societies, and they're forming on the internet, you know, forming on Facebook. There's all kinds of societies for different kinds of insects now. And yeah, I mean, I didn't get a chance to mention this, but I think as we look down the future, you know, I was thinking, what can we do beyond offering nest boxes? Probably one of the things we can do is try to enhance the quality of vegetation and hopefully enhance the supply of insects for our own trails, at least. So yeah, I think, I don't know what it's going to take to have a meaningful impact. Another thing that occurs to me is I always think, you know, if I had an area, if I live in a suburb right now where bluebirds seldom come in here, but you know, if a person could design a roost box, if you were in an area where you had a lot of bluebirds and you were having these storms, you could easily design a larger roost box that would accommodate a fair number of bluebirds and keep it warm with solar powered. It doesn't take much just to keep it from being deadly cold. Once you stop the wind, that's a big part of it. And you could even fix it up with food and things like, I mean, there are things that we could do. And you could say, well, you can't affect the population that way. That's silly. On the other hand, maybe somebody said that when somebody said, well, we could put up nest boxes for bluebirds. We can save bluebirds. Somebody might have said, well, you idiot, you can't affect the population by putting up a few nest boxes. Then it turns out enough people got interested in it that we did have an effect. So there may be, you know, thinking out of the box, there may be things that we can do in addition. And some people, for example, feed their bluebirds all year round on mealworms. Now, not everybody can afford to do that or has the time or interest. But I know we have a lot of people around the country that are doing that. You know, they have feeding stations set up to run all winter. And these are people as far north as Tennessee Pennsylvania doing this.
Well,
Now, if they have roost areas, maybe they can save some of their bluebirds when this ice storm comes through. You were talking about.
yeah, and we saw that exact example on our trail that was out in the country. We went from 90 bluebirds the next one year to 20 the following year because of the ice storm. In our suburban area where people were feeding mealworms, we saw no drop in the same ice storm. So
Wow.
yeah, where they had food, they were able to survive. It wasn't the cold, it was the food availability of food, I think, that really caused the problem.
Food and water. Yeah, well, sounds like you got a good article there to write up, Don. That'd be a good story.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay. This is what you wanted to do as another assignment. All right. Well, I enjoyed having this chance to meet with you.
Thank you. We enjoyed it. We picked up a lot of info, and we'll look for the recording for the folks who couldn't make it.
I'll send you the link when I get it posted.
All right, thanks.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.